Another week, another day in Hebrews. So, if you haven't met me before, my name is Wiley. I help out with the link, the children's and youth, and all the other ministries. I kind of help out, and Billy asked me to come today and to talk about and to discuss and to dive into this section of Hebrews. Now, Pastor Billy, he's kept saying all throughout the study that this is probably his last time going through the book of Hebrews as a pastor. So, if you can imagine, he's not covering this section, so that puts a lot of weight on me. So, I feel like I have the expectation to cover this section as much as he has with all the years of preaching that he's experienced. It's like he's giving me the keys to that beat-up truck of his and says, return it. And I'm like, man, I really hope I don't mess this up. There's probably going to be some gears that grind here, but we're going to get through it. So, to catch up, if you didn't know what we were talking about, think about the 3 songs that you just sang in worship. We'll be talking about what we covered last week and then going further with it, and that is faith. So, at the end of chapter 10 and going into chapter 11, we talked about this idea of faith and what faith really is. And we got a really good definition, a very precise definition, a one-sentence definition from the author of Hebrews in chapter 11, verse 1. And he said, "Now faith is the certainty of things hoped for, a proof of things not seen. For by it the people of old gained approval." Now that second part is where we're going to be going today. But it is a certainty of things hoped for and a proof of things not seen. So last week we touched the topic, is faith blind? No, faith is not blind. We don't jump into it not knowing what's going on. Faith is not blind. And it's not some whimsical thing that we just kind of hope is going to happen, but is a certain type of hope. It is a confidence of things hoped for, and it's proof of things not seen. Now that word proof, it means there's got to be evidence. And we'll see evidence of God's faith throughout the Old Testament today. So what is our faith? So we see this idea of faith float all around the Bible. And a believer today has a very specific faith compared to that of the people in the Old Testament. So what is the faith of believers? What do we trust in? And if you haven't been paying attention throughout the whole study of Hebrews, the answer is very simple. Jesus. That Jesus is better than ... Put a little ellipses there, and that's Hebrews. Jesus is better than the angels. He's better than Melchizedek. He's better than any sacrifice. He's better than any king, prophet, priest, or king. He's the ultimate prophet, priest, or king. Jesus is just better. So that's what our faith is in. Our faith is that Jesus is better. We see examples of this all throughout the book of Mark. Jesus, he would heal these people. He healed a lame person, a woman hemorrhaging for years on end. He healed a blind man, and he calmed these storms. And all those stories are wrapped up in the idea of faith. Trusting that Jesus is able to handle this situation, giving it to him. And even in the story of the storm, they didn't have faith. And then they did, and then Jesus calmed the storm. But he healed people because of their faith, because of their trust in him. Now, don't hear what I'm not saying. Don't hear that God's going to do whatever you want for yourself because you say that you believe. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that genuine faith, genuine believing in Jesus as being better, as he being the sacrifice, as he being God, God will do miraculous things for his own glory. So, I want to set up an outline before we really dive in to today's scripture. I'll be starting at 13. I believe I had 17 at the beginning, but I'll be backing up a little bit at 13, and then we'll be zooming all the way to verse 40. That's a lot of verses for me, guys. Again, a big responsibility. So, we'll be starting in verses 13, and 13 through 16 really shows an outline of what kind of was happening in the Old Testament. Now think of 13 and 16, and then 39 and 40. Think of those as little brackets. Think of them as brackets, or like a tapestry. Those are the seams. So we're going to be looking at this piece in this big quilt, or whatever analogy you want to use. But those are the brackets, seams. Those are the edges of where we're talking here. All right? And they both revolve around the fact that the people in the Old Testament did not see the end of the promise. They were given a covenant, and they didn't get to see the end of it. They were given this promise. They were told these great things will happen, but they didn't get to see it happen. Now, the end, then we'll hear it's better for us. And their faith is made complete in Jesus as well. And our faith is better than all that, because we get to look back in something that's completed. But we'll save that for the end. So in the middle, so they didn't get to see the end of the promise. First, we're going to focus on the family of Genesis. So Father Abraham. And then we'll go to the faith of Moses. Then we'll stop by, talk about the faith of Israel. And then we'll talk about what kind of faith they all had. And that's an enduring faith. Now, as you know, Hebrews is very cyclical. It goes in a circle. This argument that he's making that Jesus is better, it comes back around. So that last point, the second to last one, faith in suffering, we will hit that really hard next week. Billy will focus on that next week. And you'll see if you read ahead. I challenge you to read ahead. It's pretty good stuff. In chapter 12, that we'll be talking about a persevering faith, persevering through suffering. But I want to give you an outline for where we're going today. So, first thing, before we get straight into the scripture, salvation by faith. Now, if you've studied your solas or done a lot of theology classes, you know that faith is a very critical part of salvation. It is one of the most fundamental pieces of actually believing. It actually goes hand in hand with believing. Knowing something is true, you believe it, you trust it. So salvation by faith, or being saved from your sin by faith, is nothing new. All the people of the Old Testament believed it. All the way back to Abel, we see it. Even in Adam, they would have faith. They would have to trust, or they didn't trust in God, and then God would respond. So salvation by faith is nothing new. It's seen all throughout the Old Testament. And the reason why it's important here in Hebrews is because it's not just left in the Old Testament. We didn't leave salvation by faith behind. We are still living in that same idea of salvation by faith. Stephen, he talked about it in his final speech in Acts 7. He talked about salvation by faith. And who did he start with when he started preaching? He started with the example of Abraham. Paul, he taught the same. He taught salvation by faith, and he started with the example of Abraham. And guess what? In Hebrews, we're going to start with the example of Abraham. So we're going to look at Abraham's faith and how it went throughout his family in verses 17 through 22. So read along with me. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And the one who had received the promise was offering up his only son. It was he to whom it was said, "Through Isaac your descendant shall be named." He considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which he has also received back. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau, and regarding things to come. By faith, Jacob, as he was dying, blessed each of his sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of Exodus of the sons of Israel, and gave orders concerning his bones. So, Abraham's faith was passed down through his family. Maybe you have family members that you've seen and had great examples of faith. Maybe you had a grandma or a grandpa or a great-grandma or even a great-great-grandma. That was pretty crazy. I had a great-grandmother, and she had great-great-grandchildren. But we have these examples that are given to us. Now, God, he provided examples for us too in Scripture through his chosen people. So Abraham. Who was Abraham? Now, if you've been in church for any amount of time, or if you like studying the Old Testament, then you probably know who Abraham is. But I want to just jump back to Genesis, the end of Genesis 11. This is where we're first introduced to Abraham. He was better known as Abram back then, and then God changed his name later. But let's hear about Abraham's family. Where did he come from? What's he all about? So, he lived after the Tower of Babel. So if you've never heard the story of Tower of Babel, they built this huge tower. They wanted to go up to God, and God was like, Not going to happen. He split them all up, and they all spoke different languages so they can never work together again. So, awful. Split all the people. They dispersed everywhere. And he's living in the aftermath of all this. Now, he had a father. His father was named Terah. And that's where we're going to start. Now, these are the records of the generation of Terah. Terah became a father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran became the father of Lot. Haran died in the presence of his father Terah, in the land of his birth, in Ur of the Chaldeans. Abram and Nahor took wives for themselves. The name of Abram's wife was Sarah, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Isaac. Sarah was barren, she had no children. Yet Terah took Abram, his son, and Lot, the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarah, the daughter-in-law, his son, Abraham's wife, and they went out together from Ur of the Chaldeans in order to enter the land of Canaan. And they went as far as Haran and settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Now, there's actually a lot in here, and I'm not going to spend too much time, but this is the background of Abraham, right before it goes into where God speaks to him. But we got to remember, these are real people who lived real lives here on earth. We're just looking back, like looking back at our ancestors. Let's look at their story. So Abraham had a father named Terah. Seems like a pretty cool guy, had 3 sons. So that's cool. So he had a couple brothers. They probably wrestled a little bit, maybe fought a little bit. We know his grandson, Jacob, really liked to wrestle. But we see that Abraham, he had 2 brothers, and one of his brothers had a son named Lot. So Abraham, he had a nephew. That's pretty cool. I have a nephew. I love my nephew. And he had a brother, Haran, and he died in the presence of his father. Now that's got to be rough. Let's put that into your context. What if you had a brother that died in the presence of your father? That would probably be something you have to deal with the rest of your life. And Terah, his dad, he probably had to deal with that. And he probably didn't want to stick around that land because of this problem. He didn't want to keep remembering the fact that his son died right in front of him. That would be a tough thing to deal with. So they moved out. I don't know if that's the reason why they moved out, but they did. So Abraham, he was basically there. He was probably a steady person in his family, tried to just make sure all the managings of the tent, because they were nomads, they made sure the tent was set up right and just kept everything organized and whatnot. And then Terah, his father, passed away at a really ripe old age of 205. Whew. But Terah, he died in Haran. He died in the land named after his son. Now, that's something that's probably lived with Abram the rest of his life. And he's dealing with all this. He's trying to make sure his family's all right. He now has a brother. He only has one brother now. He's watching after his nephew. His wife doesn't have a kid, so he's probably watching after that nephew like his own son. And he has all these family dynamics going on. And he's got a lot going on in his life. He's now in a new land where he actually didn't grow up. And he's having to deal with all of this. And then God, like how most of the stories in Genesis go, then God, he called to Abram. And he said, now go forth from your country and your relatives, and from your father's house to the land I will show you. And I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great. And so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you. And anyone who curses you, I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. Whew. You got everything going on in your life. And then God comes out and he says, go forth from your country. Like, God, I just moved here. Like, haven't even settled the land yet. I have this whole family with me. Go forth. Abraham, as we know, he had faith. He had a messed up background. He had faith, though. He trusted in God. He trusted that this command, this covenant promise God made with him, is true. He knew it was true. So what did he do? How did Abraham show his faith? What was his faith in? It was in God. How did he show his faith? It was his obedience. The next verse. And he went. He obeyed God. He went out and he did what God told him to do. Did he mess up along the way? Yes. He's still a human like us. Remember, He's not some superhuman. He is a human just like us. And he messed up even after God called him. And God worked with him as he went along the way, and he fulfilled the promise that God had. And in Hebrews, he talks about the offering up of Isaac. Now, Isaac was his only son. Does that sound familiar? His only son. And he offered him up. But God, he made a promise with Abraham that through Isaac, through his son, all those nations will be a blessing, and those will be my people. So Abraham, he knew, he's like, I can trust in God. I've trusted in him this far. I can trust in him more, that a great nation will come through my son. I only have one real son. He had another son, but that's another story. This son is the one God promised. He's like, I'm going to trust in God in this. Even if God kills him, he can bring him back from the dead to bring a whole nation. I'm going to trust in God through this. Now God, what did he do? He provided another sacrifice so that he wouldn't have to sacrifice his son. He provided another sacrifice on top of that mountain. Just in time, too. But Abraham, he had faith. We see evidence of his faith. He had confidence. But what was his confidence in? It was in God. Another question here. Where was the focus of his confidence? Was it in the past, present, or in the future? Well, we see that his focus had to be in the future. He was focusing on what God will do. What God will do in the future. He will bring a nation. He will make his people his own. He will glorify his people. He will make a land for his people, build up a nation for his people. And he will provide a person for that, all their salvation. So that was Abraham. And guess what? There's a whole family that goes along with it, all the way down. The examples that we saw, the other examples, were Isaac, and then we saw that Isaac blessed his sons Esau and Jacob. They had a whole family dynamic that was going on, and it was not really fun. It was brothers that basically fought the whole time. Also, Jacob was the inventor of the pop socket. But we got to move on here. So Jacob, he was dying, he blessed his sons, Joseph, and it kept going on all the way to Exodus. Now, if you've ever touched on the book of Exodus, there's a guy there, and his name is Moses. And that's where it starts off. Let's see what the author of Hebrews has to say about Moses. By faith, Moses, this is Hebrews 11:23. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents, because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called a son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy temporary pleasures of sin, considering the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt. He was looking to the reward. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he had preserved, as though seeing him who was unseen. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as through dry land. The Egyptians, when they attempted it, they drowned. So, who is Moses? We probably have some presuppositions going on to this. We probably heard the name Moses, probably heard the story of the Red Sea. And the good thing is the author actually expects you to know these people. He expects you to have studied all these people in the past. But if you haven't, and for me being my first time preaching this, I'm going to cover a little bit on the life of Moses. So, who was Moses? Moses, he's introduced, told to us, Exodus 2. So Genesis, Exodus, next book. He was born to Levite parents who sent him down the river to be raised by Egyptians. So the king, the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, or Pharaoh of Egypt, leader of Egypt, he didn't want any of the Israelites to have their firstborn sons because he heard that there was the story of like somebody's going to like come up and raise a nation, it's going to like take us over, and he was kind of scared. So he was going to wipe out all the sons, the firstborn sons of the Israelites because they were in slavery. He didn't want his slaves, his servants, to take over his nation. He was trying to control his nation. But God allowed Moses' family to send him down the river to be raised by the Pharaoh's family. So the Pharaoh's family actually raised up Moses. Isn't that ironic? So raised up Moses and by Moses or the Pharaoh's daughter, and rather than be identified as an Egyptian, oh, you were raised as an Egyptian, you should be an Egyptian. No, I'm not Egyptian. That's what Moses said. I'm actually an Israelite. And he was probably well spoken. He probably knew the things of Egypt. But Moses, he obeyed God. He obeyed God. But it wasn't without some type of hiccups along the way. So if you think back, go back to the beginning of Exodus, you may have heard another story of the burning bush. But even before that, there's a little snippet of Moses that you might not know about. So Moses, before the burning bush, after he was raised by the Pharaoh, he realized he was an Israelite, and he was going out, and he was seeing what the Israelite people were doing. And he happened upon this disagreement that was going on between an Israelite and an Egyptian. And he decided to step in, and he saw it was getting heated, and he stepped in, intervened, and he ended up killing the Egyptian. So guess what? Moses is a murderer. They don't really teach that in Sunday school all the time. So we got a murderer who went back, and then he came back out, and he was going about his way, and then he saw two other Israelites, and they knew what he did, and so he got shamed by his own people, and he said, I'm out. I'm going to go. They call me a murderer. I was just trying to help my own people. I'm going to leave this land. So he left the land of the people where all his people were slaves. He said, I'm out. I don't want to have anything to do with this. I'm done. I'm going. So he left. And then there's the story of the burning bush. So messed up situation, God comes and intervenes. And that's basically how the whole Old Testament works. There's a messed up situation that we cannot fix. And then God intervenes. He spoke to him through the burning bush. He told him that he was going to be the person that led them out of Egypt. And he's like, what? They don't even like me. Like, they don't even want me around. He said, but God said, I will make a way. I will make the plagues. I will provide you with help along the way. Moses said, but I got to stutter. So, and God said that I didn't stutter, and you're going to go do it. So he went, and he had faith. And that was the Mosaic covenant in a nutshell. So he made promises to Moses. God made promises to Moses. There's other part of this, and that is the Ten Commandments. Many of y'all have heard the Ten Commandments. Many of y'all probably broke one of the Ten Commandments this morning. So we'll get to that later. But the Ten Commandments, God provided Moses with a law to rule these people. So God is the leader of these people, not Pharaoh. They don't have a human leader. They have God. So God, being their leader, said, I'm going to give you a law because you can't necessarily just govern yourselves without knowing what to do. I will make you a nation. You will be my people, and you will follow me. You will live with me. We will live together. You will be my people. So God gave them the Ten Commandments, and they lived by the Ten Commandments. And guess what? They're just like us. They messed up on the Ten Commandments probably every day. So God gave them a sacrificial system, saying, okay, you messed up. We'll do these things, and you can be in right relationship with me. And earlier, throughout the book of Hebrews, we talked about the order of Melchizedek, and that's kind of where he comes into play. He was that priest that came in, and he was the perfect priest, and he did the sacrifices perfectly. But guess what? He was still a man, and he was still flawed. And Jesus is still better than Melchizedek. Jesus is our better priest. He's also our better sacrifice. So he's the prophet, he's the priest, he's the king, and he's the sacrifice. He's everything that we need. So Moses, he had faith in God, that God would rule his people. And he trusted in God. He still messed up. He struck the rock, if you've ever heard that story. God didn't tell him to strike a rock, but he struck the rock. He disobeyed God. And guess what? He never entered the land which God called him to pursue. Never entered it. He didn't see the fulfillment of the promise. Now the rest, as we move along, the rest of that next section talks about all these other names. It doesn't really get their stories in Hebrews, but it talks about their names. Up at the beginning of verse 30 in chapter 11, we see all these names pop up. And not much story is given. And the author didn't need to tell their story, because by the time he got to the story of Moses, he's like, you know where I'm going with this. So here's all these other people. Every example that you've seen in the Old Testament saw the same thing. They either had faith in God and a future promise that God was going to fulfill, or they didn't. And he gave examples, the best examples that he could, of the people that did have faith in God and the promises that God gave them. So, what type of faith did they have? They had a future-focused faith. We see that, future-focused. It's in the covenant that God will fulfill. But they also had a faith that will endure. 35 through 38 talks about how all these different struggles and challenges and just straight out awful things they had to endure with their faith. They had other nations come up and almost wipe them completely out. They were captured by other nations multiple times. And then, if you look at the book of Judges, not even going to get into there, there was all these awful things where they would turn to their own way. They didn't have faith. But the people that did have faith had to endure all these things. All these awful mocking, flogging, imprisonment, chains, all these other things. And their faith allowed them to endure. So, we get to verse 39. And this is where it kind of turns the page. It's the end of the seam that we were talking about there. And all these, having gained approval through their faith, did not receive what was promised. All right? Sounds like verse 13. Where's the author going here? Verse 40. Because God had provided something better for us, so that apart from us, they would not be made perfect. Their faith, the faith of all the people of the Old Testament, all those patriarchs, all their faith was made perfect in Jesus. It was not complete until Jesus. When Jesus said, "It is finished," he was speaking of their covenants, of all of that. It is finished. All those promises are done. It is finished. And he set up what we call a new covenant. And that new covenant is in Jesus. Jesus speaks of his own new covenant in the book of Luke. Luke 22, he speaks at communion, or the Last Supper. We had communion a couple weeks ago, and we even spoke about it that we have a new covenant. And not just a new covenant, not just something different, but something better. Something way better than we can imagine. Something better than any promise of a nation or promise of a law or all these other promises. Is better than all of those things because, like Billy said a couple weeks ago, we get God in this covenant. We get access to him. We get to know him. We get to interact with him. We get to pray and speak to him. He gets to speak to us through his word. We have a better covenant through Jesus. And it only comes through believing in Jesus by the power of the Spirit. So by the Spirit, through Jesus, we are redeemed back to the Father. That's the only way that we can have this covenant, is by the Spirit. He applies that to us. We see in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 2, the whole beginning of the church, chapter 1 and 2, beginning of the church, the apostles, they were kind of doing their thing in the room, and the Spirit came. And then after that, the church began, and thousands of thousands were believing. And that wasn't by their own works. That was by the Spirit. It is only by the Spirit that we can believe, or we can have faith. And the author of Hebrews, he's showing us that the Spirit applies that better faith, a better covenant. It's something better. So, as I get to the applications here, I've got 3 questions. And I've asked these 3 questions of all the patriarchs already. The first one, who are you? Who are you? It's the identity question. Who are you? We saw that Abraham, he was pretty messed up, got a messed up family situation. Moses murdered a guy, didn't want to be around these people, messed up situation. Who are you? Are you worse than that? Well, guess what? You probably are. And God can still use you. The Spirit can still save you. You are not too far gone for God to save. You are not too far gone. Romans 3 gives us a really good perspective on who we are. Paul wrote this knowing that we're probably going to question who we are. Like, who am I? But we're going to question who we are. And the simple fact is we are sinners. We are people separated from God, and apart from God, we can do no good. There's nothing good that I can do alone. Anything I try to do on my own work will end up hurting somebody, will end up making a situation worse, will just be downright evil. You heard in the psalm, evildoers. We're evildoers apart from God. We can't do good. And it is only in God that we can do any good. So Romans 3 reminds us who we are. We are sinners separated from God. And that's not going to change unless something changes. And that's not going to be from us, because obviously if we're depraved, if we can't do anything, then we can't do anything for ourselves. We just can't help ourselves. We are stuck where we are unless somebody else or something else comes to change that. And that's the Spirit. He comes and changes people's lives, gives them faith to believe. So what is your faith in? What is your trust, your confidence, your evidence, your proof, all those words that we used at the beginning? What is your faith in? Is your trust in something that changes or doesn't change? We look around and it seems like literally everything changes, or everything is at least changeable. You think you're in a career? Nope, gone. You think you're in a steady relationship? Nope, gone. You think that your phone's going to work forever? Nope, battery dies. Or you think all these things are certain, but they're not. There's only one thing that is certain. That is God, his promise, his covenant, and his identity. God does not change. We can have faith in God because he doesn't change. Our faith is not in ourselves. It is in God. We put that on him because we know he doesn't change and that we do. And we pray that God changes us towards him. And he does by the Spirit. So what is your faith in? Is it in God, unchanging, who is faithful? Or is it in something else? And the last part here, what is the evidence of your faith? We see proof of what faith is. What is the evidence that you have faith? How do I know that you believe? How do you know that you believe? A lot of people say it. A lot of people might show up here Sunday morning. There's probably hundreds of thousands of people in churches all across America this morning that say, yes, I'm a Christian. We see the whole evangelical check mark on their voter ID or whatever, or however they do statistics. But they say they believe. How do you know? How do you know that you believe? Well, one word, like Abraham, like Moses, all the patriarchs, obedience. Are you doing what God asked you to do? Are you obeying your father and mother? Are you loving others? Are you serving others? Are you preaching his word? Are you going out and sharing the good news of what Jesus has done? Are you doing those things? Are you living in a gracious way? Are you living graciously? Well, shoot, don't take my word for it. Don't take my word for it. Don't listen to my words. Listen to the scripture. Listen to what Galatians 5 says. It says the fruit of the Spirit. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, and self-control. Do you have those things? That's an evaluation. Is the Spirit working in me? Am I producing these fruit? We see, I believe, in Luke, apart from Jesus, if we're not abiding in Jesus, the whole binding the vine, the branches, the vine, abiding, that whole idea, we see that apart from him, we're not making fruit. A vine cut off is not making fruit. Are you making fruit? Do you see love, joy, peace, patience, kindness in your life? Do other people see it in your life? That can help you confirm that, to know that you believe. But we don't need to be stuck in this, do I believe? We don't need to be stuck there. We need to evaluate, and then we need to move on in obedience. It's okay to go back and check and make sure you believe. It's good. Very good. I encourage that. Maybe do it once a day. But we need to make sure that we believe, and then we need to obey. We need to go out and act in obedience and share the truth with other people. The truth that God is faithful, more faithful than any of their friends, more faithful than their job, more faithful than anything else, and that they can put their trust in him. So are you putting your trust in God? I'd like to pray. Lord,